Hello, and thank you for joining us in our online Bible study. My name is James, and I'm the preacher here at the Early Church of Christ. And tonight we are going to be in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 1. Now, if you haven't been with us before, we're going through the book of Philippians. You don't have to have been here for any of those previous ones, but you can find them in our archives, either on Facebook under Wednesday Night Bible Studies or on YouTube under Wednesday Night Bible Studies or Philippians. There's a little subdivision playlist there for the book of Philippians. And you can watch those anytime you want, share those with whomever you like. And we hope that it encourages you. All right, so Philippians chapter 3. I'm going to read this from the English Standard Version. That's just allergies. Don't worry, you're not going to catch anything through the interwebs or whatever you want to call it. But you might see me grab my tea every now and then. And for the Star Trek fans, Earl Grey hot, but I was drinking it before Picard was. So there you go. Philippians chapter 3, verse 1. Again, the English Standard Version, if you've got, on your app, you can choose if you want to follow the same one. And I'll go probably through verse 11. Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me and is safe for you. Look out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. Though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcision on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead. Okay, it's hard for me to stop there because I love chapter 3. I want to keep reading, but we'll stop there for this week. And let's go back. It sets the tone for what he's going to say in the second half of the chapter that we'll look at next week. He begins by saying finally, and true to form, he's a preacher, right? He says finally. It's only halfway through the letter. So that's why I don't like to say the word finally. It scares people. But Paul is only halfway through and he's already saying it. But he says, finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things is no trouble. And what does he mean? He's going to tell us, how do we find joy in our Christianity? But first he's got to deal with some things, because there are people who are trying to influence the church at Philippi, along with other places where Paul has gone. Let me give you a little background. Paul is planting these churches, and there is a group of people who kind of go along behind him, sometimes catch up with him, and they had caught up with him at one point. And they're constantly trying to undermine what he's teaching. And what he's teaching is grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And they are people who come from the same background as Paul. So they're people who were Jews. They don't necessarily represent all Jews, but they represented people kind of his background, which meant Pharisees, people who were high up in the religious hierarchy and order. They are people with great influence. They are people with very strict understandings and very strict interpretations of the law. And they are people who have a lot of extra requirements above the law. Some of these had claimed to converted to Christ, but Paul is going to tell them that as long as you're trying to save yourself through your righteous acts, as long as you think you are saved by law, you haven't really converted to Christ, because you can't be saved by Christ and by the law at the same time. It is either grace or it is law. There is no in between. And so that's background, and that's the message of much of the book of Romans. It's the message of pretty much all of the book of Galatians, and we'll look at an excerpt from Galatians here in a second. It's what he repeats in Ephesians and in Philippians and to Timothy when he writes him, and to the Thessalonians. He has to say it over and over again because they just don't get it. Well, why is that? Why were they so determined to save themselves? Why were they so trusting in their own resumes instead of in the sacrifice of Christ on the cross? Why would you do that? If somebody says to you, I'll save you by grace, why would you say, no, I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which, as we'll see in a moment, isn't even possible? Why? Well, there's a bit of human nature involved. There's pride involved, and there is just a religious bent involved. And all three of those things, the human nature, pride, and that religious bent that they had that comes in a lot of different forms, they all still happen. And so this is not just, don't tune out because you think, oh, we're going to look at something that was, relevant 2,000 years ago, but not now. Oh, no, this is stuff that happens all the time. Just, maybe it comes in a different t-shirt, but it still happens, still shows up, and still dogs us to this day. So let's dive into some of the details of what Paul is getting at and see why and what the problem really is, and why is it so important that we 2,000 years later are still looking at it, and that God wanted to preserve it so we would. Let's do that. Verse 2, he says, look out for the dogs. And he says, look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, and look out for those who mutilate the flesh. They're all the same people, okay? Dogs, evildoers, mutilators. It sounds like I'm quoting Tater from Car. Tater? How about Mater? I don't even know my vegetables tonight. This could be good. One of those nights. D, I did not have coffee. It's tea. It's lower in caffeine, so I don't know what my problem is. You had to be there the last couple of Sundays to know why I said that. I might have been a little hyper the last couple of Sundays. So here we are. Look out for the dogs, the evildoers, and the mutilators of the flesh. Those are those guys who are going around following Paul and constantly undermining that I mentioned. And they're doing that because they want to believe, that in order for the Gentiles, and Paul is the preacher to Jews first, but then to the Gentiles, and God has appointed him to go first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles with the gospel, with, in the big picture, the ultimate goal of bringing Jew and Gentile together under the umbrella of Christ. Okay? And they don't like it. That's it. Bottom line, they don't like it. They look at these newcomers, these Gentiles, and they aren't having to do everything that we had to do, and we don't think that's right. And if I had to do it, you have to do it. And if I was raised that way, you should be raised that way. And if my grandpa said that was right, it's right for you. Does that sound familiar? You ever hear stuff like that? More so, do you ever say stuff like that? Now, I'm not going to call names, but I've been in a small group with a couple of you who've said it, This is still a way we view things. We constantly think that everybody in the next generation better do it the way I did it, and better think it the way I thought it, and better practice it the way I practiced it, or it's wrong. Well, if the way I did it was right, and I mean right like according to God and His Word, and the only way to do it, according to God and His Word, not according to my interpretation, but according to God and His Word, then I would have grounds to have that expectation. But often what they did, and often what we do, is to bind our interpretations and traditions on one another that come from the past. And they're not all bad, okay? Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. They're not necessarily all bad. They're not even necessarily all evil. They're not necessarily all wrong interpretations in terms of what's supposed to be done. But sometimes our attitude is wrong. Sometimes our application is wrong. And sometimes, in their case, and this is probably less so with us, but in their case, sometimes we're still trying to bind old ways, and we're trying to put new wine into old wineskins. That's the way Jesus put it. We're trying to force the gospel into they were, the gospel into the old law, and that doesn't work. And so they're trying to say to the Gentiles, the pet thing was, your men have to be circumcised. And if your men aren't circumcised, then they're not saved. And if they're not saved, then they're not my brother. And if they're not my brother, they're going to hell. And it was that was their problem. They believed that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised. Why circumcision? Because that's a good question, right? I wonder sometimes when new Christians who don't have like a religious background until they became a Christian, I often wonder if they don't sit in one of these classes or watch one of these videos and go, dude, why in the world are they talking about circumcision all the time? What is the deal? That's so weird. And why would a Christian in 2020 be even worried about that particular issue? Well, let me calm your worries. If you're new, we're in 2020, we're really not worried about this, and we don't talk about it and focus on it all the time, except when we're dealing with a passage where, for example, here the Apostle Paul brings it up because in his time and his context it was a big deal. The arguments now would not be over circumcision. The arguments now would be over other things, and I don't even know that we need to get into them tonight, but there would be other issues that we would talk about that would be less foreign to our time and culture and worries, right? But at their time, circumcision, according to the old law, okay, rightfully so, circumcision was the sign of someone who was born into the covenant between God and Israel. And that sign was important, so important that when if you didn't get that done, God upset with you. God got upset with you. It was like you were supposed to have gotten that done. 8th day, don't put it off, right? So that's why it was important at the time. It was required by the law. The law, of course, was written by God, so required by God. And it was a sign that you really were a part of that covenant and of the people of God. And so when a male would convert to Judaism, if they were a Gentile proselyte converting to Judaism, then they would need to be circumcised under the old covenant. If a child is born into a Jewish household, a male child is born into a Jewish household, then he would need to be circumcised on the 8th day, according to the law, as a sign of keeping the covenant and committing to the covenant with God as a child of God and a citizen of Israel. And so it meant important things, and it was required by their faith. Okay, so that's important to know. This is not just them being sticklers. It really was a big deal if you were under the old covenant. The problem is that Paul is talking to people who are no longer under the old covenant. That covenant was fulfilled through Jesus' death on the cross. Fulfilled meaning completely, like all the requirements of the law were met, and the covenant were met, and therefore done. It's just like when you go buy a car, the last payment is done. You turn that, the bank turns that into the state. The state then sends you the title, the means of, or the conditions of the loan have been fulfilled. That loan is no longer on your back, and you are no longer required to send money, right? And the car is yours. When Jesus dies on the cross, that same kind of thing sort of is what happens. He fulfills all the terms of the covenant, and they are set free. And now we are under a new covenant with Christ. And that new covenant does not come through law keeping. That new covenant does not have a payment book at all. Instead, it is a covenant of love and of grace that says, you and I are in relationship, and I have done everything necessary for you to be in this relationship. I have paid the price on the cross. And so it's just a completely different thing. You can see, okay, we give the people that he's talking to a hard time. Paul gives them a hard time. I do think you can see, or I can anyway, and I don't think I'm special in this. You can see how people coming from an old way of doing things have a difficulty giving that old point of view up. And so we understand why they would struggle. We understand why it's difficult to change such a mindset from a mindset of, I must always keep these laws perfectly, even though I can't, but I must still do it, to a covenant in which Jesus has done all the perfect work for us. He is our perfection. And now I rely on grace, and I rely on Him, and am set free. That's hard. It seems like being set free would be an awesome thing, right? It seems like receiving a free gift would be just wonderful. I mean, why in the world would I have a problem with that? But there's this thing of, if I've had to do it for 50 years, how come this guy gets to come in here at the last minute, so to speak, and they don't have to do everything I did? That's not right. Why don't they have to do everything I did? I've used this example a few times to explain it. I was listening one time to an interview of somebody who was, I think they worked for the government high up. It wasn't the Surgeon General, but close, office down the hall kind of a government employee. And they were talking about the regulations of becoming a doctor and all the rules of becoming a doctor and residencies and things like that, and how research has definitely shown that there are better ways to do it than the way we do it. And research has absolutely shown that some of the old ways of doing residencies, where those who are in residence are working these horrible, long, exhaustive hours and not even able to go home between shifts and all this stuff, can actually be dangerous. And one of the things that this employee was talking about was, they were showing the research that showed where there had at times been bad things happen because people had simply been overworked. But they were overworked according to the rules, according to the small l law, right? Regulations, rules and regulations, and laws and expectations. And so they were asked, well, why don't we change that then? If we know that it's dangerous at times, if we know that it's not actually even the best for the learning of the resident, and it's not the best experience for them, it's not the best way to learn, to teach, or to be treated if you're the patient, and the patient should be number one on this list, then why don't we change that? And here's the answer. So they talked to all the people who are those teaching doctors and professors and everybody else in the hospitals and hospital administrators. And the doctors especially spoke up and said this: if I had to do it, they have to do it. No long argument, no wonderful logical points. Just simply, well, if I had to do it, they have to do it. And that was it. And so we put people in danger every single day. We put those residents at risk of malpractice because of exhaustion and everything every day, and for no deeper thought than, if I had to do it, they have to do it. It's just a little bit of cockiness of the flesh, isn't it? But that's the way it is. And you've probably experienced that in some way, either in your upbringing or in your schooling or in your job or in your church or in some other religion. Some way or another, I guarantee you, you've had that experience. And maybe even you agree with it. I don't know. But here's the deal. Paul is looking at these men who are basically making the same claim. If I had to be circumcised, they had to be circumcised. And if they're not, they're going to hell and they're not really my brother. He looks at that and says, you guys need to knock it off because you're acting like dogs, evildoers, and mutilators of the flesh. Is that strong language? That's how strongly Paul felt about it. And he felt about it that strongly because Paul had been one of them. It wasn't theory for him. Paul had been one of them. And so when he uses this, let's look at the terms he uses. Verse 2, we're only to verse 2. Wow, I'm not moving very fast. But if I have to sit through it, you have to sit through it. No, I'm kidding. So look out for the dogs. The dogs, the term he uses for dogs here is like a pack of wild dogs. And so he's telling them, and it's kind of interesting, he's telling them, you people who require this are like a pack of wild dogs that just run around and are chasing them down and nipping at their heels and are abusing them and chasing them like prey. And it's wrong. You're going from place to place, teaching this false gospel that enslaves people back to the law. And you need to stop it, brothers. And so he tells them, first, you're like dogs. Now, why does he use that term? One, it's very descriptive. But two, this is the term that they would use of those non-Christian Gentiles and non-Jewish Gentiles. Obviously, non-Jewish Gentiles, that's redundant. But that's what the term that they would use in a derogatory way. So he's flipping it on them. And he says, you want to talk dogs? Let's talk dogs. Who is it that's chasing? Who is it that's nipping? Who is it that's howling? Who is it that's abusing? Who is it that's piling on and ganging up on? Guys, it's you. And you've got a false gospel. You're evildoers. That's self-explanatory. It's wrong. It's evil, Paul is getting at, to undermine the gospel and grace of Jesus Christ, even if you think you're doing it in the name of Christ. It's wrong. And he says, you are mutilators of the flesh. All you're doing is mutilating their flesh. You're not helping them in any way whatsoever. It's an unnecessary surgery, right? Let's go back to the medical thing. It's a wonderful thing if you go into the doctor and you need an emergency appendectomy or emergency gallbladder surgery or something like that. That's a wonderful thing when you're able to get the surgery that you need. But if you go in and you need gallbladder surgery and your doctor removes your spleen, he's a mutilator of the flesh. And that's what's happening here. People are coming to Christ, and they're coming to find grace and redemption and to follow Jesus. And these guys are stopping them, and in a form of religious malpractice, they are requiring of them a surgery that does not need doing physically, but even more so spiritually. And it's harmful. And he says, we are the circumcision. He says, you think you're of the circumcision. You're not. You're just mutilating flesh. We are actually, those of us preaching and teaching the grace of Christ are those who are really of the circumcision. He says, those who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus. Now he expands on that in Colossians chapter 2. So if you got your Bible, turn to Colossians chapter 2. He's talking to a different church with the same problem of these people trying to require the same things. In verse 8 he says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. So here he says, you as a Christian, saved by grace, are children of the circumcision, but not that old physical kind done by human hands, not a mutilation of the flesh, but by the Spirit of God, who comes and removes the flesh, the sinful nature, the pride of in their case, he's going to use this term of the flesh in Philippians to talk about, as N.T. Wright says, the flesh in terms of pride in your physical descent. These men who were preaching this false gospel and trying to bind physical circumcision on the Gentiles were doing so out of pride in the fact that they were Jews and that they were Jewish Christians and that they had been around longer. You see this still in different ways. If you try to join a Christian church and you're never one of them because your daddy wasn't so-and-so, or your mama wasn't so-and-so, or your grandpa wasn't so-and-so, and you're never fully accepted as a brother because you came from the wrong family tree, or you came from out of town. A friend of mine one time told me that he had lived in a certain place 19 years and was still the new guy. Still the new guy. And was still treated like, yeah, but you're not really one of us. Small towns, you get that a lot. Small churches, you get that a lot. Small churches in the first century, you got that. Well, God accepts you Gentiles now, but unless you've been circumcised, you're not really one of us. You're not fully one of us. You're second class at best in the church of God. And that's always wrong. What Paul is telling them in the book of Colossians is, your rightness to be in this family of God comes through your faith in Christ, and it comes through what the Spirit has done through you. And there he says, all of us who were baptized into Christ were saved by Christ through faith, not through the act. Sometimes people try to use baptism like another circumcision and try to say, you were saved by the baptism itself. Well, no, not the physical act. You're not. You're saved by your faith in Christ that led you there. You're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, grace through faith in Jesus Christ is going to lead you to be baptized into Christ every time. Every time. But, were you saved because you were so great and did the right thing? Nope, because you didn't save yourself. We're saved by grace through faith, through the resurrection power of God. And in Colossians, go on down to verses 10, 11, and 12, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So if you're a note taker, Colossians 2, 8 to go all the way to 11 or 12. That'll help you understand all that stuff. So let's go back to Philippians chapter 3. He says, you want to talk resumes? You want to talk who might come from the right line? Let's talk. And he starts bragging about who he was. He says, I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh. If anyone thinks that he has reason for confidence, I have more. Isn't that something? I've got more than you. My resume is better. In fact, I think Paul would be one of those people who would say, I don't have a resume, I have a curriculum vitae. It has to be better than just a simple resume. And so it's that sort of a thing. And he says, I have more. And yet, he's going to make a fool of himself on purpose to say, none of that matters. He says, if anyone else thinks he has reason and confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, I did it right. By the people of Israel, I was from the right group. From the tribe of Benjamin, I was right from the right family. A Hebrew of Hebrews. You think you're an American? I'm a great American. You think you're a Christian? I'm a holier than thou Christian. You think you're, this is what he's saying. As to the law, a Pharisee. I was of the strictest branch of the keepers of the law, and I even had extra laws. I was better than you. And then he says, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. You were probably sitting in your lazy boy talking about, isn't this new Christian thing terrible? I was actually doing something about it. That's what he says. Under the law, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. I was blameless. Bold statement. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish. Paul actually, by the way, uses a heavier word than that in the Greek. Not just rubbish, not just trash. Okay? So he considers it all just a big manure pile. Go out past a dairy, look at where they have to store that manure until they can do something with it. He says, that over there, that's my resume. Everything I ever said to impress God, it's over there in the dung heap because Jesus saved me. Now that I know the surpassing love of Christ, now that I know Jesus my Lord, I lost all that. I'm no longer considered Mr. Pharisee. I'm no longer considered the Hebrew of the Hebrews. Some of them think I'm a traitor. And he says, and I don't care because I know Jesus. Pride of descent, pride of resume, pride of history, pride of tradition, pride of I've done so well, pride of all those things he says, who needs it? None of it's any good. None of it's worth anything because I know Jesus. He said, I can be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, verse 9, that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain to the resurrection of the dead. He said, I don't care. I don't care what the legalists say. I don't care what my resume looks like anymore. Paul's saying, I found peace. I found mercy. I found grace. I found a stillness in my soul that couldn't exist when I was worried about saving myself because I found Jesus. I found the one who loved me not for my resume, not for what I did right, but who loves me in spite of everything I did wrong, and who loves me with undying grace. And that is who he says we all need to know We need to know Christ. I love that song. I want to know Christ and the power of his rising, to share in his suffering and be conformed to his death. That's straight out of Philippians chapter 3. And we sing that because we know that in Christ, we finally have found hope. We will know the power of his rising. But we only know it when we stop trying to save ourselves, when we stop trying to puff up our chests and think that our resume and our genealogy and our history in a particular group is what makes us significant and what makes us important. And instead, one thing and one thing alone makes us important to God and in this world. Do we know Christ? Have we let Christ become our Savior? Have we given our life over to him in grace and faith? Have we surrendered our life, as Colossians 2 is talking about, just surrender our life to the grace of Jesus Christ, and through faith been buried with him, saved through him, raised with him to a whole new life? Because if we have, what a hope we have, the resurrection of Jesus Christ and his saints. And don't let anybody, Paul is saying, try to take that away from you, because grace is greater than our sin, but it's also greater than we could ever accomplish on our own. We can't make it on our own. And that's a good thing, because we get to know Christ. God bless you. Have a good night, and join us again next week as we go further into what Paul is teaching here in Philippians chapter 3.